Allora iniziamo. Buonasera a tutti e benvenuti. Io sono Ilaria Menolascina, curatrice di OGR Public Program, e questa sera ho l'onore di accogliere due ospiti importanti che sono un po' le protagoniste di questa giornata e per un po' di tempo di uno degli spazi delle OGR. Accolgo quindi l'artista Susan Hiller e la curatrice Barbara Casavecchia. Susan Hiller la conosciamo, è un'artista di fama internazionale che dalla fine degli anni 60 ha iniziato ad operare nell'arte concettuale e ha allestito mostre nei più importanti musei del mondo. Possiamo citarne alcuni: l'ICA di Londra, la Tate Liverpool, la Tate Britain, biennali praticamente ovunque, la Biennale di Berlino, la Biennale di Mosca, la Biennale di Sydney, Kassel. Insomma, un'artista che ha girato il mondo, che è ora approdata a Torino, alle OGR, con una mostra dal titolo Social Facts, Fatti sociali, che da questa sera fino al 24 giugno potrete ammirare nel binario 1 delle OGR. Vi ringrazio per essere qui e ringrazio ancora moltissimo Susan Hiller e Barbara Casavecchia. Buon proseguimento.
Grazie mille. Una informazione tecnica: è disponibile una traduzione in tempo reale, ci sono le cuffie, abbiamo una traduzione simultanea, quindi visto che la conversazione si svolgerà in inglese, per favore usate le cuffie. Grazie a tutti per essere venuti. I have a first question, which I'm reading it because I want to make sure I get it right. This week, I read in the news that scientists have discovered a network of fluid-filled tissue that lines the body. It's apparently a new organ, so far unseen and undetected. And they decided to christen it interstitium, that is, interstice, the space between the structures of our body. So, since your Geyser described, for instance, your work as the unseen interstice between thought and desire, I thought it was, I don't know, perfect timing, because it is in that space, I think, that quite often your work takes place.
That organ is what the cancer cells travel around the body on that organ, and I hope that's not, you're not making an analogy. You're not, are you really?
No, I'm not.
That would be very unfortunate.
I was thinking about the interstice.
Yes, about the in-between place.
Yes.
Yeah, which is really a place, but is invisible. Yes, that's what interests me, actually, the between, and there are technical words for this: liminality, the zone of liminality, if you like, or some people would relegate it to the unconscious, which actually runs our lives, although we don't know that it does most of the time. Yes, that's what I'm interested in, and so my works tend to set up a kind of structure where you're given either or positions, but then you have to situate yourself in between somehow, you know? Of course, most of you haven't seen the exhibition yet, so this probably sounds very abstract. We're doing our best, okay? All right, Barbara, next question.
So, I think that, well, of course, we're talking about an unseen exhibition, so we're just moving along the same tracks, but there are different possibilities, I mean, visually, to think about how we see things, or how things are turned into either images or abstract form, because they come from light, basically. Yeah. I mean, our way to record things, it's mostly based on photography, which is obviously, I mean, the using of photos, light. But then there is also the new work, which is titled Illuminazioni, because it has an Italian title, which is translated as Illuminations. And I think there are many different possibilities of thinking about the presence of light and what, I mean, when there is light, we see something, and when we do not perceive light, we think we're not seeing something. But do you think it's too abstract?
Do you want me to talk about light? I mean, here's the thing. I'm not very good at abstractions, all right? But I'm very interested in the fact that most visionary and mystical experiences have to do with light and the quality of light. And I noticed that online there is a lot of material produced by scientists where they translate the light that occurs in the universe as sound. So they're making an analogy between light and sound because both are waveforms, yeah? And that resonated with me because I have been collecting stories about people who have mysterious experiences with light forms. And as we've discussed, what happens in both these sort of situations is a kind of translation. That is, the scientists are translating the light into audio so that we can experience it in a certain way. And the people who've had these sorts of encounters are attempting in words to describe something, an experience that is completely new to them and they have no category for it. And they do the best they can to tell us about it in words. So then I basically put those two ideas together to make this work called Illuminations in English. And of course, as we all know, you know the light bulb that goes off, the cartoon picture of an illumination, meaning both light and an insight of some kind. And the piece kind of balances on that edge. You know.
The piece, I mean, is also a mix of sounds and voices. And I was kind of looking back on a piece of yours, which is titled Body and Soul, and you were discussing about several associations relating to the body and the soul and how we perceive one thing as contemporary, one maybe as more ancient or whatever, but things change so quickly. But there is a sentence which I really like, which is, body is blurry.
Well.
And then it said, voice is body. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more by why you were often fascinated by the fact that stories are not only to be read, but also to be listened to and to be embodied by people's voices.
Yes, this is a thread, if you like, that has interested me for a long time. When you hear a sound, you actually physically experience it in a way that you don't when you see something. So voice, when you hear the voice of a person, you are actually hearing their vibration, their personal vibration in your ears, which to me is kind of an intimate idea. It's not at a distance, it's here, right with you all the time, which is why I like to work with voices a lot. And as to body being blurry, I mean, you were saying to me as we were walking here about bodies being multiple and so forth. I think our whole idea of body has changed so much over the past few years. I don't think people think of themselves as having such a unified, concrete, cleanly outlined form. So these things are coming together more and more in my work, and I'm trying to find very concrete ways of sharing them with people. So I'm not polemicizing about it. I'm using these ideas in a very concrete way in the works. But we're making it sound very abstract, actually, you know, which this exhibition is not about abstractions. If we talked about channels, for example, which is a piece using analog media rather than digital media, with 300 and something analog television sets, we'd have to talk about it differently. Because in that work, where I am presenting the work of the voices of people talking about near-death experiences, the television set as a physical object, and particularly the analog television set, is the basic metaphor that the whole piece revolves around, because scientists who've been dealing with near-death experiences and similar kinds of experiences that people have, which we'll come back to in a second, because I want to emphasize that these kinds of experiences are ancient, and they exist in every culture that I'm aware of, but with the new technology of being able, for example, to resuscitate someone who's had a heart attack, this happens in our times frequently. So more and more people are reporting these kinds of experiences that happen in the moment when they are physically dead, and then they're resuscitated, and yet something happens, although supposedly the brain isn't functioning, okay? Now, to get back to the television set, some of the scientists working on these ideas quite early on said that the brain actually should be thought of as a television set. That is, or radio, you could say radio as well. It doesn't originate thoughts, it receives them, which suggests that consciousness is a much greater phenomenon than something that lives inside our head. So that's the basis of that work, but it's got this concrete foundation. Okay, did I go off on a tangent? Yes, sorry.
No, I wouldn't think so. No, I mean, there are many questions I would attach to this, but the first one would be also, of course, and we discussed about this a lot when we were doing the installation. I mean, working with hundreds of old television sets means also having to face the fact that technology dies.
Yes.
We always think of technology as something sort of constantly, I don't know, new, and sort of just born or just happening while you look at it. But we also experience the passing of technologies very quickly.
I think you're referring to the fact that these television sets are old and they're dying. That's totally appropriate to the work. It's about death. So the TVs die from time to time as well. But the reason I'm using analog television sets is analog TV, like radio, receives bits of the so-called Big Bang in the form of static. That has been completely eliminated from digital media. And one could see that as a kind of loss. We don't even think about it. But these television sets are connected to the ancient universe in a way that the new digital sets aren't. And that was important for that work.
But you also, for instance, in the series Hommage to Marcel Duchamp, and you use digital medias and digital images a lot. Yeah, when it's appropriate.
But I also do, paintings and so forth. This particular exhibition is very electronic, isn't it? Even though some of the imagery is ancient, like the floor piece, which is Labyrinths, which I have represented from 3 different cathedrals. And you know these, should I talk about that? These labyrinths are...
I'll just say the title, which is From Here to Eternity, so you can locate it on your map, just talking about this virtual exhibition.
Okay, so in a number of cathedrals in France and Italy and Germany, there are the very, very large labyrinths in black and white tiles on the floors of cathedrals. And this is intriguing because they all have titles like The Road to Jerusalem or The Path to Heaven or something like this. Now, a labyrinth is different from a maze. A maze is confusing. A labyrinth only has one right way to go. There's no other way to go. And if you hesitate at each point, you might go the wrong way, but you'll soon come to a dead end and you have to come back. You're being guided toward the center. And this was a kind of not even a metaphor, an analogy. For pilgrims who couldn't go to the Holy Land could go to a cathedral and in a very contemplative state of mind could walk around the correct pathway and mentally have an experience which would be apparently similar to pilgrimage, an actual physical, geographic pilgrimage. So here, you can't really walk around them because they're not big enough, but you can follow with your eyes some little dots that are walking the right path, and that actually can have quite an interesting effect if you're patient and actually follow the dot. It also reminds me and other people of some very early video games that were like this. Was it Pac-Man had a labyrinth? And it refers to quite a lot of contemporary abstract painting, because labyrinths appear a lot in the work of various painters. So,
Well, when I finally saw it in place, apologies, I cold. The architecture of Binario Uno and this entire building is quite impressive. When you look at it, if you look up, it really looks like a basilica or a cathedral or something. So it was interesting somehow to reposition on the floor.
Yeah, that's right.
What had been found somewhere else, but in an architecture built somehow for giving you this sense of space, and also for... And what I thought as well is that now we would, probably look at a pilgrimage to Jerusalem as a virtual trip somewhere. Sort of retranslating certain experiences thanks to digital technologies in different ways now. And there's a whole level of possible abstraction or fiction which goes with them.
I don't know. I'm not a theoretician of the digital age, but I know that there are repetitions. For example, the auras. That's another element in the exhibition that you haven't seen yet. Aura pictures, photographs of people. These are us. They're not just a mystical way of thinking about the human, but this is us. We've dissolved into light. We're pixels, really. This is how representation works now. So there is a curious coming back of some of these ideas in a different form. And all of that interests me. And in this building, which you pointed out, has all these Gothic and ecclesiastical references. It was an interesting exercise to pick out those works of mine that kind of reference that. It's not all my work is around these particular ideas, but the works in this exhibition are, because it was suitable for the building, I thought.
Just to go back for a second to something you were saying about the perception we have of our own bodies. Of course, there's an inner body and outer. But I think one of the reasons why I think it's so interesting to look at the number of things you've been at work on over decades, literally, is that lately we perceive a sort of loss of borders somehow, because you exist in reality, you exist online, you exist in a number of at the same time, simultaneous dimensions. And some have physical reality, some others have a different reality, which is nonetheless emotionally very present, and so on and so on. So I wanted to ask you if you could say again why you find interesting, for instance, to look for things in internet, and why there is...
Why I find it interesting. I would be very eccentric if I didn't find the internet interesting, but I think you specifically mean as a resource for these kinds of ideas. Well, because it's all out there, and it's almost a cliche to say that the internet is like a confessional booth, and anybody can just say the most awful things online and remain anonymous, or they can talk about these sorts of things and remain anonymous while realizing that if they tried to talk about them with their friends, it would be very embarrassing. So instead they can address many fictional friends. And I find all of that very interesting, of course. And there's no lack of, if you like, spirituality of certain kinds online. And I have used it as a resource, yes, because it's there. And that's why we call the show Social Facts, because although the the deep subject matter, if you like, may be approaches to spirituality or questions about the nature of reality or these kinds of things. Actually, it's just so very available that it's ordinary. But it isn't so accessible to people unless you bring it together somehow. So one of the elements in my work has always been collecting a lot of different examples of things so that something becomes very visible.
That's also a question I wanted to ask you, because I think since the very beginning of your work, you've always been interested in somehow, well, studying, of course, but I mean, studying, it's different. I mean, using as material for your work a number of collective dynamics.
Yeah, I like to put together, I find it a pleasure, a real pleasure to put together examples of things which are supposedly similar, only to discover that each is different. Because I think this describes all of us as people. I mean, we're all people, but we're no two alike. And so it is with collections. The pleasure of collecting is to find a lot of things which may be in the same category, but each one is just ever so slightly different. And that's the way I like to collect.
But you also usually work on either collections or social facts, say, that are not necessarily at the very core of the mainstream. So you look for things that are often positioned around the margins or considered, I mean, not so interesting or not so established in terms of what should be collected and accepted.
True. But that's because I would justify this by saying that I'm a feminist, and so I'm interested in differences, and I am interested in things that are a little bit elusive, and I sometimes joke, almost jokingly say I'm interested in ghosts, because what is a ghost? A ghost is a being of some kind that most people don't see, but some people see. And some of the things that I like to work with are things that are, they're there, they're certainly there, but most people don't see them.
Or don't want, or don't know how to describe the experience also, which I think it's also another important part of several of the works here.
But this is one of the jobs of artists, isn't it? That's why people who are very romantic used to say that the artist is the antenna of the society. That is a very pretentious way to put the. Excuse me, we're both suffering here. To put the point that one of the things that artists do is they have to define their own work. What is their work, for goodness sake? And that puts them in a strange position because their social formations, our social formations, are the same as everybody else's. But within this, we have to find some kind of meaning. And so we see things a little bit differently, I think. And because of that, it ends up with things that you were saying were a little bit unusual, rare, not noticed, but increasingly they are noticed. That's the thing. I think when I started off doing this kind of work, it seemed odd. It doesn't seem to seem odd to anybody anymore.
Well, I think we are redefining odd in a number of ways, but I remember one of the first time we met, we were discussing about the fact that, I mean, for instance, now we have fake news and alternative facts, I mean, as ways of describing what's happening and what's coming to us as a sort of source of information, or what lies in the possibility of understanding what we consider a fact, or what we consider news.
Well, that's why I use the concept social facts for this. You know what a social fact is. A long time ago, Durkheim, one of the great anthropologists, this must be about 150 years ago, used this concept social fact to talk about things like religion, and any institution is a social fact. He also said gossip was a social fact. Suicide. And he had a whole category of ideas about this. And it's a very interesting thing to think about things as social facts, because, for example, to waste time debating whether UFOs are real or not, without defining what real might mean, but if you think of them as a social fact, that is, that millions and millions of people say that they've seen them, then you can get into a different kind of discussion. So that's why it's a very interesting category, I think. It's not true or false. See, it's not like fake news. We think fake news is fake. It's not true. But then what is truth?
Well, we're also...
Okay.
One of the things I was thinking about is that lately, I mean, the adjective social is so pervasive, and it's of course much related to social media, for instance, which is how apparently, I mean, most of the news, whether fake or not, traveling, and of course all the debates, I mean, over the last couple of weeks about how by using social media in a sort of very tactical and big data-based way, I mean, you can actually change culture. That's basically, I mean, the sort of the bottom line. I mean, if you want to change politics, you change culture. So I got lost.
You lost. Okay. Well, we're all lost in that. You know, this is an interesting thing because what is a true fact? I mean, you know, this is ridiculous. The discussion needs to be more subtle than that. And so to say this is a false fact well, how can that be? I mean, so the idea of a social fact is social formation. And if you think of our whole notion of the real is a social formation. And this is interesting to me because it relies on us as human beings to be different in the way we perceive our lives and everything. And yeah, okay, let's not go there. This is not about art, really. But, I mean, art doesn't say it's true. That's for sure.
Yeah.
We never make a truth claim.
This morning, you were talking about John Keats and negative capability.
Well, I know you did a show about this. I found this recently that you did this. Yes, negative capability, you know, Keats the poet, and also a very famous Italian article, early feminist article by Anne Suzot Boetti, was called Negative Capability as Practice in Women's Art. And that comes from the poet, the English Romantic poet Keats, who wrote that to be able to remain in the state of negative capability was the basis of poetry. And by negative capability, which he went on to describe, he meant to remain in doubt. And I think that's an interesting situation to be in.
Yeah, I picked the quote, and it's beautiful, so I'm just going to read it because it's capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So it's, of course, very... But just to go back for a second to what you were just mentioning, I mean, of course, I'm more than fascinated by your feminist side and a number of works you've done. And I think when I read when I watched, in fact, a number of works, and they were language-based, the importance of using language which is not the dominant language, or to find languages which are not the dominant ones, or even your work, I mean, which was presented at Documenta, which was called Lost and Found, and it was based on lost languages, or languages which are not spoken anymore. And it's, of course, I mean, it's all about speaking that language and allowing some room for other languages to emerge, and what a richness can be found in these possibilities of listening to different voices and sort of understanding that there's more than one version. So.
Yes, and that's where the feminism comes in, of course, because of experiences as, you see, of course, mine formation was longer ago than that of most of the people in this room who are having a completely different experience of gender positions in life. But, you know, the idea was that women's voices were being suppressed because they wanted to speak differently. And to speak differently tended to be seen as incoherence.
Or irrational.
Or irrational, yes, or any of these quite negative things. And And I always was happy when that became clarified and people began to realize that there were, as you say, many varieties of acceptable speaking, to say all sorts of different things. And in fact, one of the things that I think I said this earlier, but I'll just emphasize it again, one of the things that makes me want to work with stories that people tell about their experiences is that there is a struggle to bring into language something so weird that happens to you. And I'm very interested in that, and I respect their the way that they can do it. I mean, you know, it's not easy. And these are just people who accidentally have some experience that is not really encoded very clearly in our language.
I think I also wanted to ask you, while instead of using the so-called real voices, you ask, you find the stories, and then you find people who are willing to read them. For instance, Illuminazioni has the voices of a number of people from London and Turin who volunteered to give their voice to that piece. I mean, because there is a huge difference in between using the person speaking about his or her own experience and it's kind of mediating or retranslating and, for instance, translating into Italian so that it could become accessible, but it's just...
Yeah, well, first of all, I could never get hold of all the people who were the original providers of the stories because they're mainly anonymous and, you know, it's not possible. But I'm also interested in representation, what it means to represent. I mean, you know, you do a picture of apples, it's not the real apples. And this is art. But I didn't use actors because I wanted actual people who were interested and wanted to, in a way, become a vehicle for the voice of somebody else. And so that's what you'll hear. You don't hear the actual real person who posted the story online, but you hear somebody else who is enacting that person, representing that person.
Which I think it sort of brings us back to translations. I mean, each time there is the desire to translate either a light phenomenon into words, and it's really hard, or to translate the cosmic radiation traveling across time and space into light, sound, whatever, or to translate a number of experiences into... And this is also very present in your way of working.
I think my idea of a good, satisfying artwork is when things kind of line up, you know, and one thing and another have relationships that are intertwined in a way. So all those forms of translation, to me, work together to make something happen for the viewer.
And also, another question would be, Channels has many, many languages in it. Why are you so interested in multiplying number of languages?
It's because in that particular work, I'm trying to demonstrate, without being pedantic, the fact that these stories are universal, that you're going to find them in every culture, and that gives us, sorry, can you not hear me? That gives us a perspective on the existence of these stories in our own culture. They're not so odd if you can find them everywhere.
I have a question about, it's probably the last work we didn't speak about, which is Psy Girls.
Yes.
Which is also, I mean, the first chronologically wise, because it's from 1999, so right before.
Yeah.
And it's a large video installation you'll find as soon as you walking to your right. And that, again, is about a sort of a universal character somehow, although a universal character mostly in fiction. That is the young girl with psychic powers, telekinetic powers, and you've used cinema in this case. I mean, sort of a number of clips. And, well, I don't want to spoil the surprise if you haven't seen the piece, but of course, I mean, that's a cliche again. I mean, somehow, that figure or that construction of a character who's about
I would never break it down to one thing like that. Basically, I'm showing the ambivalence that our society has toward these female figures who are immensely powerful and quite often very upset about it. And then others are very happy about it. And so there you are, the viewer, in a situation where I'm using the sound, the audio, in a rather controlling way, which I admit to, because I'm aware how much sound in a film drives the mood of the story. So I'm using a kind of rhythmic soundtrack, which comes from a gospel choir. And then silence, equal intervals of silence and this kind of musical clapping. And they affect you physically differently. So the clapping sort of raises your blood pressure and makes you feel like dancing or moving, and also, in relationship to the film clips, sort of gives them a dimension of believability almost, although you know perfectly well these are just movies. When the silence is in force, of course you have a critical viewing stance, and you think, oh God, these are just movies, you know. So I like to play with those two possibilities, because that is the basic situation that Barbara was describing at the beginning. It's the in-between. So where are we as viewers of this kind of material?
Well, also what we're drawn into believing somehow.
Yes, exactly.
But what moves us, or what makes us believe into something. It's also... I have one last question.
You keep saying that.
No, it's the last one. It's really the last one. You can see it on the page.
Yes, okay.
And it's about another expression you use quite often in interviews, etc., and it is being true to materials.
Yeah.
And on this, I would like to, I mean, if you could...
Well, I don't know if people... This was dogma when I was interested in studying art, you know, becoming an artist. Truth and materials went on and on and on and on. It's in itself a very ridiculous notion, because as Henry Moore said, do you know who Henry Moore, the English sculptor?
I would think so.
He was the person who was lumbered with this description, because he had used it a few times in talking about sculpture. And in fact, he said eventually, well, how can bronze, you can't talk about truth and materials of working in bronze. He said, if you're making a snowman, then you're really being true to materials, because you can only make this sort of very crude shape. That's truth and materials. So it's an ambiguous idea, but it has to do with the fact, for me, that I like to have the subject matter and the materials in close relationship to each other. So if I'm making something about film, I like to use film, or, you know, I wouldn't take it any further than that.
Okay, I think I promised it would be not too long a conversation, so I mean, would you accept maybe one question, or would you rather?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's up to people if they want, you know, maybe people want to leave and go see the exhibition.
Well, yeah, in 10 minutes it will open. It's still closed.
Oh, it's still closed. Oh dear, we have time to kill. Okay.
Is there any question? Okay, then we can.
No questions.
Take a break.
No. Okay, fine.
Oh, one question. There it goes.
Yeah.
Just like I was curious because of the great multidisciplinary effects that you have in your works, how you came to, when you understood you want to become an artist, as you were saying before, how did it happen as your multiple interests for so many disciplines?
What?
Could you hear me? No. Shall I speak louder?
Yeah, maybe.
Like this? Can you hear me? No.
A bit better.
Bit better?
Yeah.
It's a bit muffled.
Yeah, I was curious to know more from you about the process of you becoming an artist, choosing art as coming from such a big number of interests in many disciplines.
I have interest in many. I don't think I have a lot of interest in many disciplines, but I couldn't do anything else. That's why. It's the only thing I could do. That was silence, wasn't it?
Yeah.
People going, what?
Silence, everybody. Okay, so.
Well, that's a true answer, you know.
I think it is.
There's no other way to be. If you want to be an artist, you have to realize that it's the only thing you can do. Otherwise, do something else.
I think people hasn't seen the exhibition.
No,
so
I
it's
know,
harder
they should
for
get
them
a
to ask
chance.
questions.
Yeah.
So I would really thank you so much.
And thank you, Barbara.
And,
Barbara curated the exhibition and did a great deal or most of the work in setting it up. So we should thank her.
Grazie, grazie.
Yeah.
Please go and see it.